Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm truly honored to be here and to be luncheon speaker at this prestigious event. Again, I am at the University of California in Davis, and I was asked to talk to you today about sustainable intensification. Now, my background is really in the environmental arena, and so I will focus a lot of my presentation. Okay. So I will focus a lot of my presentation today on the environmental portion of sustainability, even though, of course, I'm fully aware that sustainability is much broader than just environmental quality. So what I found very interesting today was the first speaker from Elanco basically told us what the 100% of consumers in a country like the United States, what they're really focusing on when you ask them what is your main focus of buying food, what is most important. And you saw that 95% of consumers said it's cost, it's taste, and it's nutrition. You saw also that 4% said we are luxury consumers, we want organic food, or we want food raised in a specific way. And then you saw that there's a 1% minority that has really a pretty extreme view of things. They basically say we should not eat meat, or we should only have a very small proportion of our diet being animal protein. And while that's good news that it's just 1%, what's not good news is that this 1% is driving the discussion. This 1% is driving the train many, many times. The place where I live in California, I can tell you that 1% is highly, highly influential. They are initiating propositions like Proposition 2, outlawing certain production practices. They are basically trying to outlaw a lot of the technologies that we are talking about at a meeting like this. It is highly important for us to pay attention to them. I will now show you a slide that talks a little bit about facts and fictions of livestock and climate change. Many of you still vividly remember the first bullet point here, namely one that says that livestock produces 18% of all global greenhouse gases. Also, from the same publication came the assertion that livestock produces more greenhouse gases than the entire global transportation system. And then, more recently, we heard one source saying that livestock does not produce 18, but 51% of all global greenhouse gases. And I want to bring to your attention that this institute, the so-called World Watch Institute, that came up with this number 51%, was quoted by no one less than the Gates Foundation recently, that put out a press release quoting that. If the Gates Foundation, as the largest international body for agricultural research finance, says that livestock produces more greenhouse gases than any other source in the world, then you should perk up your ears. That number 51% was also quoted by the New York Times not long ago, about maybe half a year ago. And the New York Times gave the author of that paper that's quoted 51% a whole page on the opinion page of the New York Times. I will tell you in a minute where those kind of things come from. Oftentimes we have people whip data until they confess. And while we are shaking our heads saying, wow, how is that possible? Those comments are normally not rebutted. And that's a big, big problem for all of you in the room. We often also hear different producer groups basically fighting each other. Grass-fed versus corn-fed and so on. We all know what I'm talking about. Or different commodities. Pork versus beef, chickens versus who knows. Okay? All of that generates a field of tension that is problematic. Many of you who know me know that I came onto the stage of discussing and debating and researching the impact that livestock has on the environment by basically discussing with the FAO, with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, their influential publication, Livestock's Long Shadow. Livestock's Long Shadow said that the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of all greenhouse gases. And it said, and that was particularly questionable to us, that livestock produces more greenhouse gases than the entire global transportation sector. Now, this discussion is largely over, but it really brought us into the discussion because we found that comparisons like that are not based on a methodology that's defendable, but that's questionable. And our lab showed that different assessment methodologies were used when comparing livestock to transportation, and that this comparison was faulty. The FAO agreed with us, and to us that was largely it. We also talked a lot to the media in order to make the world known that the comparison of livestock to transportation is not valid. Livestock's long shadow, with all its flaws, had one big advantage. The big advantage it had was that it opened up a discussion that was much needed, namely the discussion of what happens when we indeed increase animal protein production by 70%, what happens with natural resources? That is a discussion that we have to participate in and that we have been participating in. So that's a very important one. Over the years, I have worked a lot with the FAO. As was mentioned in the introduction, I have recently chaired part of a project that has been large and influential, and you will hear more about it in a few minutes. For those of you who still question whether or not this is a topic that we should consider, if you look at this slide here, it shows 3 burgers. I can hardly see them from here, but it shows 3 burgers, and that photo was taken in Sweden. It shows on your on your right side, a tofu burger, on top a turkey burger, and to the left it shows a beef burger. And these 3 burgers have blue bubbles associated with them, with numbers in them. And those numbers are not the price tags, those numbers are the carbon footprints. So if a consumer in a Swedish fast food chain looks at a burger, they not just consider price or taste, they also consider carbon footprint. Not too long ago, I watched a TV show, a very influential TV show, I might add, and the moderator said, and I quote, "If you drive a Prius and you eat 1 burger a week, then that's the same as driving a Hummer." If you drive a Prius and you eat 1 burger a week, that's the same as driving a Hummer, he said. And then he added, and that's according to the United Nations FAO. Now, this guy was totally misled, and in my opinion, what he said was highly dangerous. And I tell you why it's dangerous. It's not so much dangerous because it's hurting your industry, but it's dangerous because this person misleads the public to believe that what you use for transportation doesn't matter as long as you watch what you're eating. Okay? And that your food choices are the all-encompassing issue when it comes to determining your environmental footprint. And that's a big deal. That's actually a very big deal. I will show you in a few minutes why. This slide here is an advertisement by Toyota, and you can see again a comparison of a sheep on top and the Prius at the bottom with a green scale underneath showing that their car is cleaner than a sheep. To some of us that might look funny, but when you really think about it, it's not funny, it's quite dangerous to livestock agriculture. But that is a direct response to some of the earlier FAO and other publications that claimed that livestock contributes more to environmental degradation than the transportation sector. This slide here shows 3 molecules, and I know this is not a chemistry lecture, but I want to show them to you really quick. So you see carbon dioxide on the left side, you see methane in the center, and then you see nitrous oxide, the 3 main greenhouse gases. And the numbers above show what their potency is. CO2 has a global warming potential of 1, methane of 25, and nitrous oxide approximately 300, meaning one molecule of methane is equivalent to 25 molecules of CO2. Okay? Here comes one of the aspects to play that I pointed out earlier. I said that the Bill Gates Foundation really recently put out a number of saying 51% of global greenhouse gases come from livestock. Here's what happened. They listened, the Gates Foundation listened to a World Watch Institute, an organization consisting of 3 former World Bank employees, and these folks at the World Watch Institute said that methane does not have a global warming potential of 25, and that's really what the whole world of scientists agrees upon, but they said methane has a global warming potential of 71. And by changing that one number, that one factor, they made livestock look as bad as the number 51 does. And if then the Gates Foundation takes on something like that and the New York Times prints it and nobody says anything, then we have a little problem on our hands. These are the things that I'm confronted with all the time in the United States, and I think all of you have heard about those kind of things happening in the past. People whip data until they confess. This slide here is a pretty important one, and most scientists who work on climate issues would agree upon the conclusions I'm about to make. It shows in the bottom panel the year 1750 to 2000. And the blue line on that bottom panel shows when within that time, those 250 years, when within that time fossil fuels were taken out of the ground, fossil fuels being carbon in the form of oil, gas, and coal, taken out of the ground where they were stored for hundreds of millions of years. And what happened to those fossil fuels? What happened to that carbon? What happened to that carbon in those 50 years from 1960 to 2000? We burned it. So we took something, the carbon from the ground, and within a very short period of time we consumed it and we burned it. Now that carbon is in the air, and when solar beams from the sun hit that carbon, they heat up, and they are one of the main sources of global warming. The use of fossil fuel being one of the main sources of global warming. Most scientists, as I said, would agree this is an emission inventory from the United States showing the different sectors of society and their contribution to greenhouse gases. And it shows on the x-axis the years 1990 to 2008, on the y-axis the greenhouse gases. And what you see here in brown is the total contribution of fossil fuels to greenhouse gases. Just to give you some numbers, because numbers matter in this discussion. Some numbers. Fossil fuel use through transportation, according to the EPA, make up 26% of the greenhouse gases in the United States. Energy production and use 31%, and the total agricultural production 6%. And according to the EPA, the total livestock supply chain assessed as an LCA in the United States makes up 3.4% of all greenhouse gases. 3.4%. That's a number that is so important for you to know. Why? Because your special friends in those animal activist circles use that 18% number, or even worse, the 50% number, to give you a big black eye when they know that the official estimates are much lower, 3.4%, as I said, for all livestock and poultry species. That includes feed as well. Now, some of you have heard about Meatless Monday, I'm sure. That's a campaign that's run not just in small communities, but in communities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boulder, Colorado, Cincinnati, and so on, large metropolitan areas. And these are official policies in those metropolitan areas, and that's why you should pay attention to it. Now, in those metropolitan areas, when they have the Board of Supervisors come together to decide something like Meatless Monday, they are quoting the 18% number or the 51% number as the reason why people should stop eating meat at least one day a week. Even better, more than 1 day a week. Now, I give you a quick summary here of what we have found. It is our assessment from doing research at UC Davis and other places that the entire beef sector, the entire beef supply chain in the United States contributes to 1.4% of the greenhouse gases in this country. 1.4%. Let's now assume that the entire U.S. population would stop eating beef on Monday. That would be a 1.4% total contribution of beef divided by 7, which equates to a total reduction of 0.2% greenhouse gases if all U.S. Americans would stop eating beef on Monday. Is that nothing? No, it's not nothing. It's something, but it's very small compared to the transportation sector, which makes up 26%, energy production and use 31%. Those are numbers you should remember. Those are numbers that are important because there are many people who say that what you do through your primary industries or you as affiliated industries contributes to greater environmental harm than anything else in society. And that is simply not true. When somebody says on TV or elsewhere that eating a burger is the only thing that separates a Prius from a Hummer, then somebody should stand up and tell them the facts. Now I'm switching gears a little bit because I know, of course, this is a global group here, and really lead to some of the reasons why the FAO work is indeed very important. As I said, I disagreed with some of the earlier work, but I think that the overall idea of working on the impact that livestock has on environmental footprint is very important. On this slide you see the world human population, and it shows the years 1750 to 2050. When everybody talks about the 2050 challenge, I want to put it into a different perspective for you. As you can see here, until 1950, the human population was really quite low, 2.5 or so billion. When I was a little boy, and I'm now in my mid-40s, when I was a little boy, there were 3 billion people in the world. 3 billion, if you look at that slide. When I was a little boy, 3 billion people in the world. Today, there are 7 billion people in the world. And once I'm an old man, there will be 9.5 billion people in the world. What that really means is that throughout my lifetime, human population on this planet will have tripled. Human population will have tripled throughout my and your lifetime. And that is the take-home message, one of the take-home messages. Okay? Throughout our lifetime, we are three times more people than at the time we were born. Unbelievable. Now, what happens here with respect to animal protein consumption in the world? Some of these slides were borrowed by the FAO by Henning Steinfeld, or from Henning Steinfeld, the main author of Livestock's Long Shadow. This one here, for example, shows on the x-axis years, on the y-axis total consumption patterns of eggs, meat, milk. As you can see, all the indicators are that those proteins will go up, no doubt, particularly in the developing countries of the world. This increase in animal protein demand is largely driven by incomes. On this slide, you see on the x-axis the total per capita in growth, and on the y-axis the total amount of meat consumption. And as you can see here, if people have a lot of disposable income, they consume a lot of animal protein, and that's like the US on top. The further you go down to the bottom left, you see developing countries where people have little money, therefore little disposable money, therefore low animal protein consumption. As you can see on this slide, China is still pretty low here in the bottom left quarter. But believe me, that will change very, very rapidly. Very, very rapidly. The Chinese are waking up, and they are particularly awakening their interest and taste in beef. I would say, and I spend about a month every year in China, I would say that the Chinese don't have a clue what beef tastes like. When they do, when you take them to eat a steak, you will not hear them say anything for about 20 seconds. They just look at you. And then they say, wow, we want that. We want that. Currently, they are slicing their beef, or whatever they have, buffalo or so, into very fine, thin slices, put a bunch of sauce on top, and think that's beef. That's not beef. Once they have beef, they want exactly that. This slide was taken from Livestock's Long Shadow. It shows where in the world we have livestock situated. And as you can see, in places like the United States or here in South America, there's some red, but nothing compared to places like India or China, where they have way greater herds than in the rest of the world. This slide is impressive, but the next one is more impressive. This slide here shows in color where on this globe we have land to feed people. Those areas in color are the only areas where we can grow crop or animal protein, crop production in general or animal production. And whether we have 3 billion people, 7, 9, or 12 billion people, this is the only land we have available to feed these people. And on top of that incredible land shortage, we have other shortages of water and so on that we heard about earlier. And now we have to make an ethical choice. We have a growing human population. We heard that today, and we've heard it throughout the conference. That is a fact. We already today have 1 billion hungry people, and I mean hungry people, people starving. Every day, 25,000 kids dying from hunger. That's not just a number. That's 25,000, 10 times the number that died at 9/11, dies every day from hunger today. The question now becomes, how do we feed that growing increase in human population without depleting natural resources totally? That's the question we have to answer. That 1%, that little fringe that we saw in the Elanco presentation today, that's so verbal, so loud, and so influential to our policymakers and to our media, I might add, that 1% says stop producing meat, stop producing animal protein. They also say we should not use any of the technologies that we are discussing at this conference and others. They are totally anti-technology. And they have received a lot of open ears in Europe, I can tell you. I'm originally from Europe, and I can tell you, you cannot discuss growth implants or beta agonists or anything of that kind in Europe. People will not listen to you at all. If you even start a GMO discussion in Europe, you'll be booted out of the room. Okay, so when we talk about technologies, we are not talking about places like Europe by and large, or many other places in the world. We're currently talking about a relatively small area throughout the world. And I think that this will have to change if we indeed are serious about feeding all these people. This slide here is one of the most important slides you can take away from my presentation. It shows on the x-axis, not a beef example, but a dairy example, on the x-axis, the output per cow of fat and protein-corrected milk. So the output of milk production per cow. On the y-axis, it shows the carbon footprint of these cows. And what this slide really shows is that the less a cow produces, so the closer you are on the y-axis, the higher is its carbon footprint. The more a cow produces, so the further you are on the right side, the lower is its carbon footprint. How can that be? Well, that's easily understood to people who have an animal science background, because a lot of the diet that you give to an animal goes into maintenance, just to staying alive, keeping the body temperature up, and so on. And then once you provide nutrition above the maintenance requirements, that then goes into production. If you feed the animal a little bit about maintenance requirement, then this animal will produce milk, but at a very low rate. And therefore, the carbon footprint per unit of production is very high. And that's what you see on the left side. If you feed more to the optimal needs of this animal, then you move the whole spectrum down to the right side. I just give you a few numbers here, and I'm not doing that to open up some kind of competition, but just to give you a general overview. In the United States today, the average milk production per cow is 20,000 pounds per year. So the average cow produces around 20,000 pounds. If you want to do that in metrics, it's about half that. Okay, 20,000 pounds. Just across the border in Mexico, the average production per cow is 4,000 pounds. So you need 5 cows in Mexico to produce the same amount of milk as 1 cow in the United States. And if you go further global, let's say to India, it takes 20 cows to produce the same amount of milk as 1 cow in the US. Okay? 20 cows. What I'm not saying is, let's just transfer everything we know and do in the United States to the rest of the world. I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that there are many countries throughout the world that far underproduce, produce below their potentials. And that's a cause of great concern, not just to me, but also to organizations like the FAO. So what you see in a place like India is that the entire herd produces somewhere around this side of the graph, whereas in the more developed parts of the world, cows produce right over here. The same is true for beef. The same is true for beef. What this slide tells you is that production intensity and emission intensity are inversely related. The more you produce per livestock unit, the relatively lower is your environmental footprint. This slide was given to me by Henning Steinfeld from the FAO. Okay? So this is a slide that he now routinely shows, and I think that this is a very important slide to show. And even more, a very important slide to be understood by those people who tell your producers that they need to go back to the 1950s. Because that's exactly what your producers are listening to day after day after day. This slide was also taken from Livestock's Long Shadow. It shows on the left side the greenhouse gases by developed versus developing regions of the world. Again, this is not to talk down on anyone. This is just to see or to show that technology use has a significant impact on not just greenhouse gases, but environmental footprint overall. The more effective, the more efficient you produce, the relatively lower is your environmental footprint per unit of product. This slide here was also produced by the FAO. It shows on the x-axis different regions of the world. On the y-axis, the carbon footprint for milk. So you can see here there are large regional differences throughout the world, and these large regional differences have everything to do with efficiencies. In those areas where the carbon footprint is very high, you either have an insufficient veterinary system. Animals are allowed to have large parasite load, for example. There's insufficient nutrition. There are genetics that are not meant to produce large amounts of product, and so on. So, whereas in those areas where you see relatively low carbon footprints, we have learned to optimize. Again, just for those of you from the United States, the left side here shows North America. If you were to tease out the U.S. from Mexico, the U.S. only would have half the column it has on this slide. So what this tells you really is that what people largely talk about, namely intensive animal agriculture being detrimental to the environment, is the opposite from what's true. Today you hear a lot of people who previously said we should not be intensive, but we should go back to former production systems. You hear them say that what we need in the world is not going back to the 1950s, but what we need in the world is sustainable intensification. We need to intensify production to feed the growing global demand for animal protein. Intensify. But we have to do this not just through switching from small scale to large scale, from being what we are now to being CAFOs all over the world, but being intensive, more intensive in whatever system you produce. If you are currently a cattle producer in the Mato Grosso, for example, you can intensify by having better pastures, or by having better vet care, or by, there are many, many other instruments. So all of us, no matter where we are in the world, have the potential to sustainably intensify our production, and that's what we need to do. When I say sustainable intensification, I don't just mean looking at the environment, having a lower carbon footprint or so. I also want to highlight other areas of significance, of major significance, namely animal welfare, a very, very important issue, not just in developed countries, but throughout the world. Another one, food safety. Another one, worker health and safety and worker training. Many of our countries have problems hiring and retaining a good workforce. It's at the core of sustainability. And of course, profitability is another one. So here are a couple of the tools that FAO and others now say will help us to reach the 2050 goal of producing much more protein than we do today. Improved reproductive practices on the left side. Improved health, that's the veterinary care part of things. Improved genetics, along with more energy-dense diets, and that's true for all animal commodities. That concert will reduce the total number of animals needed to produce a given amount of product. And I will give you an example of that in just a second. In the United States, according to Jude Copper and others, we had a pretty drastic change in animal herds, yet we have not reduced animal or beef production. In 1970, we had 140 million cattle. Today, we have 90 million cattle. But even though we had a 50% shrinkage in the herd size, we still produce the same amount of beef. On the dairy side, I won't go through all the numbers, but in general, between 1950 and basically today, we have a two-thirds slower or smaller carbon footprint than we did back then. Two-thirds smaller. So we are producing approximately 60% more milk with half the number of cows. Now I'll give you another example. I told you I spent a lot of time in China, and what I'm very impressed with is to see the sheer numbers of production there. Now, most of you know in China we don't have intensive large-scale, by and large, but the vast majority of livestock raised there is still raised in relatively small scales. They have a plan, though, to intensify animal agriculture over the next 5 years. And some of you might know that particularly in the pork sector, China is the superpower in the world. Today, half of the world's pigs live in China. They have 50 million sows, each producing 20 pigs, and that makes up for 1 billion in total. So 1 billion pigs produced in China per year. Unbelievable. But here comes what's even more unbelievable. They have a pre-weaning mortality of 400 million pigs a year. Think about that for a second. 40% of their pig crop dies pre-weaning because of issues with veterinary care, issues with nutrition, and so forth. So, if a country like China has a pre-weaning mortality of 40%, what do you think they do? What do you think they do? They won't lean back or buy from here. They buy Smithfield. That's what they do. They bought a large US producer of pork, and by doing so, of course, they're also buying know-how. And that's actually a good thing. We don't want any large producer in the world to have a 40% pre-weaning mortality. That's bad for the worldwide production of pork because it sucks up large resources and leads to a very negative overall footprint of pig production. The same is true for other commodities. Today, you hear from the FAO and many others the one word, namely that sustainable intensification is key. You hear words like this: production intensity enhances biological efficiency. And lastly, production intensity and emission intensity are inversely related. I was asked to also talk briefly about a project that I've been heavily involved in with the FAO. That project is referred to as LEAP. Basically, the premise is that there's currently no internationally agreed upon methodology to measure environmental footprints of livestock. We set our path to overcome that and come up with one global methodology, a gold standard, so to say, that unites methodologies and allows us to use one throughout the world. The project that was started by the FAO is referred to as the Livestock Environmental Assessment and Performance Partnership, or LEAP. It has three main sectors: the governments, national governments that is, like the Dutch and the New Zealanders and so on. Brazil is not part of that, unfortunately, and should. I would love Brazil to be part of it. The US is not part of it either, by the way. Then the second sector is the global livestock and feed sector. So meat, meat, milk, poultry, feed, they're all included. And then also NGOs like World Wildlife Fund and others. So they are all working together to develop a methodology to assess the environmental footprint of livestock. Okay? So what we have heard over the last 2 days or so is ongoing on the global scale, and it incorporates a lot of the efforts that you've heard about here so far. So LEAP builds on existing initiatives. Some of those, here for example, you see the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, SCI Platform, Global Agenda of Action, many others are incorporated in what's going on there. There are hundreds of scientists working together to come up with one methodology that can be used in any place in the world. As you can see here, these are all the different initiatives, and I don't want to go into those in detail, but basically LEAP does a methodology development for all livestock and the feed sector and all main categories, not just environmental, but also other sustainability categories. It's a 5-phase project, and we are now in phase 3. We're about to go into phase 4. We have completed poultry, small ruminants, and the feed sector. This year we're working on cattle and on swine, and then we are almost ready to release the total reports. I think this will be very important. We are trying to put together an ISO-approved gold standard for environmental assessment globally. And I think it's very important, and I really would hope that all the membership countries and also companies that are represented in this room would join. Because something like this only becomes really relevant if it's largely accepted. So with that, I was told I'm given 30 minutes. I went 31 minutes. I'm happy to entertain any questions. Thank you very much for your attention. And yeah, thank you.